guys. And
First name. Good name. Thanks,
yeah, this is actually Kal Penn. I'll let Kal, you can stay on the stage.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I like that it's an intimate group. I feel like I don't need to do the big stage here. Thanks for the introduction. I appreciate it. Any of you guys come out to our last event a couple months ago? You did. Okay, nice. So I'm here on behalf of Senator Obama's campaign. So let me just first, thank you guys for coming here. It's actually still technically pretty early on a Sunday. It's impressive. I was thinking that we would just kind of end up leaving. So props to you guys for doing that. And Joshua, thanks for letting us use the space. I appreciate it. Yeah. It's something that. So let me just, I guess, give you a little background, and then we can open it up to Q&A. This is very casual. As far as I'm concerned, I'm just going to sit here. Does that work? Yes. Yeah, thank you. I guess that you'll see a lot of folks the next 60-something days, 67 days coming through, and trying to encourage folks to register to vote and get you guys involved in the Obama campaign. The big reason for that, especially here at Elon, has to do with what's called the quote-unquote youth vote. It kind of goes back, for me it goes back about 4 years ago. I'm a registered independent, and I've never done any campaigning or anything like that before. I've probably voted for as many Democrats as Republicans as third-party candidates depending on the election. But about 4 years ago, when I was living down in Texas, there was a buddy of mine who was working this minimum wage job at a trucking company, and his phone rang, and it was somebody from a company called Halliburton who was on the other line. And Halliburton called my friend up and said that they would offer him $90,000 if he agreed to go to Iraq to drive a truck for them, the private sector. And so he called me and a few of our other friends and said, what do I do? And we had a long conversation about it, but it really just ended in the realization that it was a really sad thing that the world's most powerful country could only offer two options to a friend of ours who wanted to go to college, either minimum wage or $90,000 in the middle of a war zone. And as a registered independent, I'd always been pretty cynical about politics. And that cynicism, I think, stemmed from something I'm assuming you can relate to, which was every time we would turn on the TV from the time we were kids, CNN and NTV News would say things like, well, if you're between the ages of 18 and 35, you're probably not really going to vote. The likelihood of you voting is very low. You heard that again this election cycle. But so those were kind of my relatively cynical, that was my relatively cynical outlook after my friend called me with the story. Thankfully, about 4 weeks after that phone call, I was watching television, the Democratic National Convention was on TV, and Barack was giving his keynote address, where he mentioned just one line that really resonated with my friends and I, and that had to do with the concept that there shouldn't be blue states and red states, we should focus on being the United States. And since half my friends are pretty conservative, the other half are pretty progressive, that was a concept that resonated with me, and when Barack decided to run for the presidency, a few of us signed up to volunteer. Do we have supporter cards back there? So we filled out pretty much a version of exactly what this is. This card back here. So we filled out this little card that had our names and email address. Checked the box and said we, voted door to door, all registered new voters, and then had the opportunity to go out to Iowa, which was the first state to have their version of the primary election. And in Iowa, we saw a repeat of, I guess, what we had seen when we were kids, which was, again, CNN and NTV News saying things like, especially college students are never going to vote, under 35s are never going to vote. And they kept citing that the average age of caucusing in 2004, the last election, was 65 years of age. So we were kind of reading that going, all right, well, let's focus on why we're here. We're here because Barack started as a community organizer on the south side of Chicago. He worked with people who were laid off by Maytag. That was important to a lot of us, especially with all the jobs that are going overseas right now. To have a president who had the experience dealing with something like that early on. The fact that he was a civil rights lawyer, we were here because he taught constitutional law for 10 years, and we thought it'd be amazing to have a president who actually read the Constitution. So we were doing it for all those reasons, but we still would hear this cynical negative tone every time we turned on the TV. And then we saw a couple of stories that were the exact opposite. They were contradictory to those. And they had to do with MySpace, Facebook, and YouTube. And particularly, they talked about, how YouTube. How many of you have watched a video on YouTube in the last 3 days? Okay. So this series of articles talked about how YouTube is free to use, obviously, but they make $7.5 million a month in advertising revenue, just because of how many of us watch videos every day or a couple of days. MySpace was another example. It was a company that started relatively recently and sold for almost $600 million. And Facebook was the best example of what we saw. It was started by 3 college guys in their 20s up in Boston. These 3 guys are still in their 20s, and Facebook got valued recently at $1.6 billion. So we looked at those articles and those news stories and said, wait a second, you're telling us that we've already made billions of dollars in wealth for our peers just by sitting in front of our computers and tagging photos and messaging friends and then waking up the next morning and untagging the photos. But that made billions of dollars for our peers who started these companies. And if we have the power to make these billions of dollars in wealth for our peers, then we certainly have the power to change the face of a presidential election. Not just one presidential election, but the way in which politics operate in this country to begin with. So you saw a huge push from people who were in college moving forward, and the day after Barack won that historic election in Iowa, there were 2 top news stories. One was that Barack Obama and Mike Huckabee won the Iowa caucuses. The second was that the youth vote, people aged 18 to 25 particularly, were the driving force behind that victory. And the youth vote in Iowa alone this past January increased by 150% over what it was in 2004. That's a trend that continued in almost every single state. I think it culminated in Florida, where the youth vote increased 300% over what it was in 2000. So you saw people from literally every single walk of life coming together. You saw Barack's campaign reaching out to folks who had historically maybe been ignored by elections before, women if you were economically disadvantaged, college students. Howard Dean talked about this a lot with the 50-state strategy that the campaign is doing right now, where they're really targeting evangelical Christian voters also, predominantly because folks under 35 who are evangelical Christians, the top 3 issues are poverty, climate change, and Darfur. And those are the 3 top issues for Barack Obama and the Democratic platform, and so why not reach out to folks who had maybe been ignored by the Democratic Party in the political process before. So as an independent, it was really nice to see all of that happen, really nice to see all those changes take place. If you saw the speech 2 days ago at the convention, you saw a lot of Republicans who got the chance to speak before Barack and share their experiences. We've been meeting folks who had buddies over in Iraq who don't have health care, who can't afford a college education. So I guess we're here today to encourage you to register to vote. If you're registered anywhere in the country but you go to school here, not only are you allowed to register on campus, but you're encouraged to, because North Carolina is a battleground state. We would love for you to register your friends. Fill out cards like this, even if you've only got an hour to help volunteer between now and the election. It's going to make a huge difference, because this is the type of grassroots organizing that you're seeing.